If you are not already subscribed to No Caps, which is a very cozy channel covering games, I recommend checking out the video called Games That Changed Me as a Person, because, well, with the channel's permission, I'm directly ripping off the concept by making this video. Even though the first game that had a profound effect on me was Pokemon Red, it's hard to quantify what that effect was exactly, besides turning me into a gamer, and everything that follows from that. I was 7 when the game hit the States and when I played through it, and most of the kids that I knew at the time had one of the versions of the game as well, and so it carried certain social aspects for me, like when I would get older kids to navigate Victory Road for me, or be terrified that they were going to trade steal on me by yanking the link cable mid-transfer. And I was into all the other parts of Pokemon too, the trading cards, the anime, maybe even more so than the video games. But mostly what that game brought to me was normalizing the act of playing video games. I had played other games before that, but never to nearly that extent. And it also introduced me to RPGs, which I was going to eventually become obsessed with in my teen years. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was practically my introduction to the idea that stories could have a meaningful effect on an audience. Like, I can remember being interested in lots of media throughout my childhood, but only really for the vibes. It was all like Winnie the Pooh and stuff. Diddy Kong Racing was the first game I ever took an on-site interest in, but that didn't really have a story, and Pokemon Stadium was probably the game I had played the most with my friends in elementary school besides maybe Super Smash Bros. Ocarina of Time was actually too hard for me to figure out as a very impatient 8-year-old, but I ended up watching my older cousin play through it, and I even printed out a strategy guide to read to him during the difficult sections like the Water Temple. But what really stuck out in my mind was just the whole time skip cutscene. I remember feeling completely mind-blown by the mere idea that Link just suddenly grew up. It felt like that cutscene lasted hours as I was trying to wrap my head around what they were explaining, just totally unable to process the idea of 7 years going by and you have not being able to account for it. I remember crying through the ending credits of the game, just feeling all this emotional weight from the experience, and it wasn't long after that I started trying to make up my own video game, by way of writing out my own game FAQs style guide on how it would be played, and drawing all the monsters and weapons and maps for the levels, by hand on paper. Golden Sun was truly a ray of light at the end of a dark period in my childhood. I played through it entirely over the course of a week-long cross-country moving disaster. I think it was the first time I ever really comprehended everything that a story was trying to say to me. I was like 11. I think I got it for my 11th birthday actually. And I got invested in the characters, which in turn then inspired me to start writing fiction. The first story I ever tried to write was called Golden Phantasy, named after combining Golden Sun with Final Fantasy, which at the time I had only heard of as the most legendary RPG series, but I'd only ever seen like 10 minutes of Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X at my dad's friend's house at the time. My story, Golden Phantasy, was also technically a sequel to my Zelda clone game, starring the children of the main character, even though I had never really clarified anything about that character besides their name. Getting into the early Gamecube era, the early 2000s, when I was a preteen, Nintendo fangirls like myself were somewhat starved for great gaming stories for a few years. I got really into anime in the meantime, with gaming being more of a way that I spent time with my younger brothers, playing stuff like Bomberman games on multiplayer, or playing Super Smash Bros. Melee, later dumping hundreds of hours into split-screen multiplayer in Phantasy Star Online. And I do remember spending some time in Animal Crossing, the original one, but it was kind of overwhelming just how much there was in that game, and learning online about all the crazy stuff that was in it made me feel like I would have to put down everything else to dedicate myself to Animal Crossing and seeing everything in it. Eventually our family finally got a PlayStation 2 because we wanted to play the Dot Hack game and Final Fantasy X, but initially both of those were actually too complicated for my brother and I when we tried them. But I finally got drawn into that console and back into gaming because of Sly Cooper, Thievius Raccoonus. My brother had bought it because of a Cartoon Network giveaway of Sly Cooper 2, and he ended up thinking that Sly Cooper 1 was too hard, but I ended up binging it in a couple of nights, and it was the first time I really appreciated the satisfaction of overcoming a difficult challenge in a game. Particularly the final boss. It took me like an hour to beat, and I can still see that experience in my mind's eye. It felt so epic and cathartic to actually accomplish. Not long after that, I got into Ratchet and Clank, and that would kind of seal the deal on getting me back into video games, at least up until a point when I stopped being able to afford them for a while, and I got into music in my teens. But before that, Tales of Symphonia made me realize that RPGs were often basically just like anime, but in a video game form, telling these longer stories that have time to really sit with their characters and with their aesthetic and flesh those things out to the fullest. I was obsessed with that game for a while in a way that I've never really gotten with any of the other RPGs or tactical RPGs that I ended up playing afterwards, possibly because none of them felt quite as much like anime. And also the next couple of Tales games didn't make it stateside, at least for a long time, which left me feeling really betrayed, so I kind of drifted away from games for a while. Around then though, I also played most of the Final Fantasy games, and all of them definitely inspired me a lot, particularly just the aesthetics, the world building, the way that they tell their stories, the pacing. But for the longest time, I'd played like all of them and hadn't beaten any of them. I got stuck the farthest into 9 and 1 and 10. I was like pretty far into each of those. I got to like the first disc of 7, 8. I got a decent ways into 6. I barely touched any of the other ones. And then finally, in my late 20s, I came back to Final Fantasy X HD and beat it. And it is one of my favorite stories in any game. It's incredibly rich, its world and characters. Honestly, if you want to hear like really great analysis of this game and of any RPG, any good JRPG, Resonant Arc, this podcast is incredible. These two guys go insanely in depth about all of these they're basically any game that's known for having a really great story. They're gonna go and try to sort of prove, and analyze why that story is so great, and they do an amazing job. So their series on Final Fantasy X is probably the best analysis of why that game is so incredible. But the 7th generation gaming kind of passed me by. I was much more passionate about other things. My brothers got invested in a lot of the big tentpole single-player experiences, so they very much became gamers. I kind of started seeing video games as like this in-the-background element. It was something I was always interested in. I've always known about it. I like research games a lot, but I wasn't really invested in actually playing games for most of this gen. In my early 20s, though, I started discovering indie games, and I got more interested in emulators and going back through and sampling older games that look interesting, replaying stuff from my childhood, going back and finally actually beating Ocarina of Time for myself, looking at smaller games that are inspired by the ones I grew up with, and especially those small-scale exploration games that people always call Metroidvania, even though they're all just Zelda. Metroid's already just Zelda, but games like Knytt Stories or Endeavor stick out in my memory as very pleasant little like 1-hour adventures, in the vein that A Short Hike eventually perfected and brought to like a whole new popularity sometime later. And that game also tremendously affected me. It is probably my go-to, I'm feeling emotional and I need to, just like disappear into a video game for an hour. There's not a lot of games that I feel compelled to play all the way to completion, but with A Short Hike, even if you don't, like, what did you waste, 30 minutes, There are a tremendous number of games that have had an effect on me. Mass Effect, for one, got me into sci-fi whole cloth. I'd ignored that genre my whole life until then. And the latest sci-fi story that I've fallen in love with, Caravan SandWitch, inspired me pretty much just on the basis of its existence to make a show about cozy games, which I could use to explore what about that game was so obviously and thoroughly captivating. If you didn't see my Game of the Year video about that game, I highly recommend giving that a watch, and of course playing that game, and subscribing to this channel if you like this type of gaming content. I'm Vera Bradley, the Bomber Girl. You can find me on Blue Sky, and my Substack linked below where the text versions of the videos are, and where you can support the channel. Thank you again for watching. Keep cozy, and cuddle on.